Fish 26. Feminism versus patriarchy. Feminism, defined. Arguably, feminism is the penultimate evil at present, because feminism is based on the misguided assumption that women are equal to, or even superior to, men. Those who undertake an academic course in gender feminist studies at college or university could most probably fill this page with definitions of feminism, but there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the core of feminism is the advocacy of women to become men, in all but genitalia. The only institution more destructive to human society than feminism is illicit governance. See Chapter 22. Equality is nonsensical. Equality is non-existent in this transactional sphere. Equality exists purely in abstract concepts such as mathematics. For instance, 1 plus 1 is precisely equal to 2, and arguably on the atomic and quantum levels, e.g., two hydrogen atoms are essentially uniform, as are two gluon subatomic particles. Even identical twins are not perfectly identical in every possible criterion. Geneticists have discovered that a pair of so-called identical twins share, on average, about only 94% of their genetics by the time they are born. Mothers of such twins can instinctually differentiate between them, since there are always distinguishing features, both psychological and somatic. Unfortunately, for a great many persons, the objective fact that equality among humans is non-existent is impossible to accept, since they are afflicted with what is known as an egalitarian, leftist, mentality. At this juncture, it is highly recommended that one read the glossary entries under leftism, adharma, and dharma, to understand this particularly pernicious, sinister mindset, and Chapter 12, to learn what constitutes true morality. The more intelligent leftists, adharma vadin, in Sanskrit will begrudgingly admit that no two human beings can be equal, in terms of their capacities and capabilities, or in their mental or physical attributes, such as their beauty, strength, or wealth, but will vehemently argue that every single human is equal in their moral worth and/or dignity, and in rare instances, spiritually equal. However, if they were forced to choose between ending the life of either a serial rapist, or that of a guiltless monk or a nun, or, let us say, a newborn child, in the case of those leftists who are particularly hostile to religious institutions, I am sure that they would choose to have the rapist executed. This is because they have deemed the life of the criminal to be of lesser, and thus, unequal, moral value than that of the monastic, or that of the innocent baby. The nature of hierarchy. Like most species of animalia, and unquestionably in the case of our nearest relatives, the great apes, Homo sapiens society is founded on an unambiguously stratified configuration. The very pinnacle of humanity is the current world teacher, whilst the lowest members of society are pre-born babies, with every other human falling somewhere in that spectrum. For, as demonstrated in the previous section, no two humans can be exactly equal in every way, and certainly not in their authority over others. Even some insect social orders, notably bees and ants, are necessarily organized hierarchically. Read chapters 19 to 25 of this Holy Scripture, FISH, to learn more about this hierarchical basis of human society. So, although a female can exhibit superior traits, skills, etc., to some men, a woman can never ever have authority over a man. Therefore, the assertion that women are subordinate to men is based solely on this notion of authority, and not on any particular attribute, such as intelligence, wisdom, beauty, physical strength, or artistic talent. Simply because a woman may be stronger or more highly educated than her husband, for instance, does not give that woman the right to instruct her master in any way. No true man has ever been attracted to a domineering, bossy female. If you have read this far into my book, it is most likely that you are in agreement with this incisive perspective. However, because this chapter of A Final Instruction Sheet for Humanity is sometimes posted in social media websites on the internet, and emailed to select individuals, independently from the entire book, many persons, notably feminists, both male and female, will undoubtedly find these notions of hierarchy and authority to be somewhat alien to their worldview. This is despite the fact that those leftists, feminists invariably acquiesce to the presumed authority of certain individuals, in more than a few facets of their own lives, such as when obeying their employers, acknowledging the authority of a judge or a magistrate in a court of law, or when following the directions of a road traffic officer. Truth be told, no true man would ever descend to the level of accepting counsel from any of his subordinates. A man should fully obey his allotted masters, such as his father, grandfather, uncle, employer, or priest, and never emasculate himself by submitting to the dictates of a mere female, or any other lesser. Of course, in past millennia, it was unnecessary to explicate the reasons why adult males are inherently superior in authority to females. Most everybody, both men and women, accepted that claim without argument, as it seemed quite sensible. However, at the time of writing, especially in the Western world, very few understand that the reason for this assertion is due simply to it being part of the natural hierarchy of society. Only emasculated, feminized men were unable to comprehend this very basic fact of life. Imagine the scenario where a woman provides the material requirements of her family, physically protects her family from harm, teaches and instructs her husband and their children. Does this appear to follow the natural order of things? Obviously not. Therefore, my point is made. Yet, despite my point being made, the typical leftist, Adharmavadan, in Sanskrit will stubbornly refuse to accept this patently evident truism. Usurping gender roles. Feminist ideology commonly manifests as the desire for women to perform the societal role of the opposite gender, that is to say, partaking in intrinsically male activities, such as studying at educational institutions, working for a wage, or building business enterprises, or even more preposterously, usurping the position of a national leader or the role of a member of the most holy priesthood. Feminism also advocates for preferential treatment of females in institutions that may have traditionally favored men and/or boys, even when the tables have been completely turned around the other way, so to speak. In a nutshell, feminists suffer from the psychological disorder termed penis envy, and fundamentally, yearn to become males in every conceivable way, sometimes even biologically, despite the demonstrably incontrovertible fact that transitioning from one gender to the other gender, being a physiological impossibility. This explains the reason why female feminists are typically manly, either in their physical appearances, or in their psychosomatic demeanors, or very often, both. After all, if feminism is defined as the aspiration for women to become like men in social stature, then it ought to be readily apparent that feminists are unfeminine. Conversely, as a general rule, the more feministic and gynocentric is a man, the more effeminate and uxorious is his behavior and his manner. This aspiration of a person wishing to seize the position of another person, deemed to be of higher value, is a common proclivity in males as well, such as in the case of working-class men who consider themselves to be rulers, kings or priests, gurus. Every so-called priest, and every national leader on earth, with virtually no exceptions, is either a worker, a businessman, or even more risibly, a mere female, who is literally stealing the occupation of an authentic guru, in the case of religious leaders, or arrogating the role of a king, in the case of the ruler of every nation or country on earth. Such persons are, therefore, full-time criminals, and ought to be censured. Only a man with the requisite qualities, the commitment, and the willingness, ought to serve in those two supremely important positions, see chapters 20 and 21, in this respect. So, proving that this author is not a misogynist, the male propensity to usurp social roles, is arguably more serious than it is in the case of females. After all, which garbage collector would not want to become the ruler of his nation, given the opportunity? Such ambitions, one cannot blame. Feminism equals egalitarianism equals Marxism. Feminists are duped victims of the slavish mentality that the instigators of that evil, pernicious ideology, i.e., Herr Karl Marx and the so-called globalist elite, have always wanted them to be. Here, it is not claimed that Marx was the first person in history to have promoted feministic dogmata, but due to the popularity of Karl's philosophical and economic views, the feminist program was thrust into this world on a scale heretofore unknown. The desire to serve is a natural propensity of humans, but one ought to serve a lawful authority, and not an evil agenda. It is exceedingly unfortunate that the vast majority of women are unable to see the obvious truth that feminist ideology wants the destruction of women, as well as society as a whole, as can clearly be seen at present. At least it is clearly seen by any decent, wise and intelligent person. Of course, from the very beginning of our species, there were most probably numerous individual women who attempted to assert dominance over their menfolk, but it was not until Herr Marx and his minions formulated their insidious egalitarian ideology of communism, that feminism started to make a significant impact on human society, at least in the so-called West, and now too, in even the most conservative cultures. The debasement of the female. Due to feminist indoctrination and lack of proper discipline, as a consequence of an increasingly profane and secular world, modern women have become extremely debased. The typical woman nowadays is afflicted with bitterness, uncontrolled emotions, especially jealousy, gross immodesty, greed, arrogance, misery, snobbishness, and loneliness due to a false sense of independence, with hardly a single noble quality. In those gynocentric societies that are dominated by feminism, men are urged to avoid any unnecessary contact with the opposite gender. Those heterosexual males who disregard this sage advice will invariably regret their choices, either after experiencing false allegations against them, the destruction of their families through divorce, or after constant rejection by snobby women with a false sense of entitlement. However, let it be made quite clear, the greatest enemy of males is not the opposite sex, but those uxorious, white knight, so-called men, who do the bidding of feminist ideologues, since they have far greater power than do females, despite being truly pathetic excuses for men. A humorous example of reverse gender roles. Because the pernicious ideology of feminism is so thoroughly entrenched in most all modern societies, I would like to give a rather humorous illustration of why it is essential for the traditional gender roles to purder. Any feminist who becomes angry at the proclamation that the only lawful role of females is as daughters, wives and mothers, should be asked the following question. Would you, assuming you're heterosexual, of course be attracted to a man who wears a French maid's uniform, and works as a housekeeper, preparing meals, laundering and mending clothes, and doing the weekly grocery shopping? If not, then you ought not reprove any man who is repulsed by a woman who dresses in a pantsuit, works as a loud and brash lawyer, and drives a fast European sports car. And, in case you consider the former scenario unrealistic, you obviously have not resided here in the Philippines, where many men work as maids. In fact, the family residing opposite to me, in my flat condominium building employs such a man. Such men are called houseboys, here in the land of transvestites, as I affectionately refer to the Philippine Islands. Obviously, at least obvious to any intelligent and wise soul, unless proper gender roles are adhered to, modern society will continue its course of disintegration, until there are practically no humans remaining. And those who do remain, will be devolved Homo sapiens, since the trend has been for the most intelligent humans to reproduce at non-replacement rates, or to avoid reproduction altogether. In fact, in recent years, there has emerged a movement called anti-natalism, whose proponents, both male and female, argue that human reproduction is unbeneficial to society, for various reasons. Additionally, we have the appearance of the MGTOW movement, men going their own way, a faction of men who choose to avoid romantic relationships with the opposite gender. Why, for example, would a wealthy and intelligent businessman risk mating with a woman who, statistically, is very likely assured of stealing his children and his hard-earned assets? Feminist women, do you believe that men ought to be the ones to give birth to your children? It sounds like a hysterically ridiculous question, right? And indeed it is. That is because, whether by design or by evolution, almost definitely by both, assuming that the metaphysics of this book is accurate, the female members of most every species of animalia are best equipped to gestate offspring. Similarly, until at least the past half-century or so, especially in the so-called West, where men have become increasingly more feminized by Marxist radicals and by poor nutrition, men are far better furnished with the physical, psychological, and emotional apparatus to perform the roles that we men have always performed, notwithstanding the fairy tale anecdotes one often hears about there existing a matriarchy in days of yore. Even if there was a matriarchal society at some place and time in the past, it is absolutely certain that the males were not the sex giving birth to children. Gynocentrism. Furthermore, many, if not most, married men who have not been divorce-raped, to use a rather crude but apt term, are still married due only to the fact that they choose to not properly discipline their thralls, out of fear that their wives will destroy their lives. Shortly after marrying my second, so-called, wife, we settled here in the Philippines, and I said to myself, thank God that we are migrating to a country where the government is not gynocentric, and therefore, will not encourage my new wife to abandon her marriage for any capricious reason, and will not prevent me from asserting my authority as the head of the family, as does the illegitimate government of my homeland. Little did I realize, however, that the Filipino government, that is, the so-called law of Piñas, was even more gynocentric than that of Australia. Not long afterwards, I was forced to either tolerate my wife's verbal insolence and physical violence, or else punish her for her heinous crimes, and risk spending the remainder of my life rotting away in an uninhabitable Filipino prison. Therefore, I would estimate that a huge proportion of marriages, in both the East and the West, are those in which the husband is reluctant to properly discipline his spouse, as well as his own children, to a lesser extent, out of fear of being persecuted by his own government. See the glossary entry under punishment, persecution. Patriarchy. Patriarchy is defined as a system of society or government, in which the father or eldest male is head of the family, and familial descent is traced through the male ancestral line. In recent times, due to the objectively immoral, wicked, evil, demonic feminist movement, it is usually defined more harshly as a system of society or government in which men in general hold the power, and women are largely excluded from it. In order to put it more succinctly, patriarchy is grounded on adult males ruling over all others, that is, ruling over boys, women, and girls. As clearly and soundly demonstrated within more than one chapter of FISH, men and women have quite distinct duties and responsibilities within human society. Adult males naturally fall into one of the four social classes, that is, priests, monarchs, farmland and business owners, and workers, whilst females are meant to serve their superiors as daughters, in the case of girls, and wives, in the case of women, by performing household chores and raising children. Sadly, of course, a large proportion of the population no longer adheres to this gender role dichotomy, particularly in the Western countries, and the chances are, if you have read this far into this holiest scripture of all, you are not among them. Radical feminists, of both sexes, invariably become noticeably upset, and sometimes aggressively violent, when they are confronted with even any mention of patriarchal ideology within public dialogue, as they wrongly believe that women should have an equal role in the governance of families and in the ruling bodies of society, and often that women ought to rule nations, as in a matriarchy, since they incorrectly assume that women are less warmongering than men. Such militant feminists and social constructionists have surmised that gender roles and gender inequity are instruments of power, and that they have become social norms to maintain control over women. Of course, power dynamics do exist in society, and provided that power is exerted according to the ethos of Dharma, the law, and societal rules, it is not at all a caustic thing. Constructionists would contend that sociobiological arguments serve to justify the oppression of women. And, by oppression, they are, in actual fact, referring to the reality that men have largely protected their womenfolk throughout human history, and in a huge number of cases, practically worship the opposite sex. See the glossary entry, gynocentrism, regarding this ugly phenomenon. When you peruse social media websites on the internet, do you generally see men belittling and scolding women, or rather, are the men desperately pursuing them? Obviously, throughout human history, some men have harmed some women, just as many women have harmed men. That has absolutely not to do with patriarchy, but solely with sin and lawlessness. Most all Western countries are now matriarchal, in the sense that women have total and utter power over their menfolk, even if that power is enforced by other, so-called males. This last quip, ought not be construed to imply that criminal males should not be held accountable for their crimes, but that, in many, if not most, cases of suspected wrongdoing, the accused man is not only innocent of any transgressions but is, rather, the victim. If a man has abused a woman, he ought to be castigated by his legitimate authority, not by the minions of any corrupt state government. Personally, I have been jailed twice for being the casualty of physical assault and verbal insults by women making blatantly false allegations against me, a very skinny, old monastic priest, and honestly consider myself to be immensely gentle, loving and kind, including the heinous crime of rape, despite the fact that I have not once fornicated. Therefore, the fact that you, the reader of this holiest book of all, are alive and well, is due largely to the institution of patriarchy, which has protected your ancestral lineage from those barbarians who have not adhered to Dharma, holy and righteous norms, based on non-violence, and if you insist that patriarchy is intrinsically harmful, you are being blatantly hypocritical, and unwittingly invoking your very own demise. Patriarchy is the only system that is normal, natural, and necessary. It is normal, natural, and necessary for a father to take charge of his nuclear family, for a grandfather to take control of his extended family, for a chief to assert authority over his clan, all the way up to a true monarch, who is considered to be the father of his people, and finally to a genuine priest, prophet, ch. 20, who is father of his nation. It is impossible for the typical woman to properly execute the role of family, clan, national head, and even if a female was found who could competently lead her family, tribe, clan, or village, there will always be a male who could have fulfilled that role to an even more competent degree, unless, of course, the male population has been decimated by the ravages of war or disease, for example. Many rules have exceptions. Patriarchy, an anecdote. In order to provide just a single example of how the notion of patriarchy is grossly misunderstood by the vast majority of humans, especially in the liberal West, I will refer to a videographed monologue, entitled, Rape in Patriarchal Culture, his own capitalization, published on an internet website called YouTube, by a Zambian chap of European descent, who goes by the fake name, Swami Rahasya. Judging by the fact that he is male, albeit a truly pathetic, white knight, beta male, and that he uses the title, Swami, which is, almost invariably, the title of a monastic spiritual master, one could be forgiven for assuming that he is in support of all dharmic concepts, including patriarchy. However, this is the opposite of the truth, since he brazenly and wrongly asserts that rape is pretty much the basis of patriarchy. In fact, it may be the core power of patriarchy. Of course, he conveniently ignores the fact that a significant proportion of sexual assaults are perpetrated by women. Anecdotally, I, the quintessential alpha male patriarch, have never sexually assaulted a solitary woman, though I have been falsely accused of such, by at least one or two filthy fat Filipino females, yet I have been the victim of several rape attempts by oversexed women, during my lengthy stay in the Philippines. Before watching the video in question, I had never heard such incredibly ludicrous assertions outside the far-left community, usually spouted by filthy fat feminist females sporting neon-colored hairstyles. It is possible that Rahasya's poisonous, gynocentric viewpoint may be caused by his drug-taking habit since, in all his internet videos, he is seen chain-smoking what appears to be toxic tobacco cigarettes coupled with a severe testosterone deficiency. Hence, one ought to be cautious when attributing malicious intent. In another video on his YouTube channel, entitled, The End of Patriarchy, the self-styled Tantra Master erroneously asserts that there was a time when humanity was matriarchal, and where the female leaders used men solely as tools for propagating the species. I can only assume that he was confusing B-grade science fiction movies of the 1960s with confirmed historical evidence, of which there is none, since any society that is truly matriarchal cannot survive for more than a short period of time, for reasons that ought be obvious after perusing this entire book. Also, this so-called, renounced monk, Swami, is the common mistransliteration of Swami. A Sanskrit title for a mendicant monastic priest claims that patriarchy is in decline, but this can never be the case, in the sense that the collapse of the patriarchy is equivalent to the complete destruction of human society. The only scenario in which society will not be decimated with the end of patriarchy is if male testosterone levels continues to decline, if public education institutions continue their Marxist indoctrination programs, and if foodstuff producers continue to contaminate food sources with chemicals and hormones that wrecks the cognitive capacity of the male as well as female population. This is because, the more that males are emasculated by the above pernicious agendas, the more likely they are to willingly accede power to women. Practically, the only sensible thing said in Swami Rahasya's inane videos is the assertion that the chief alpha male, by which he obviously means a king, ought to lead his army into battle, rather than sitting on his throne, protected in his castle. Frankly, I doubt that the Swami even knows the actual definition of the term alpha male. I asked him in the comment section of one of the aforementioned videos, but he has yet to respond to my very simple question, which is unsurprising, because he repeatedly refused to answer my even more simple question, are you vegan? Most probably due to being an animal-abusing carnist, like the vast majority of humanity, including so-called holy gurus. Far more hilarious than Swami Rahasya's idiotic opinions regarding patriarchy is the fact that he considers himself to be some kind of great religious leader, despite being a deluded, drug-addicted carnist. Unfortunately, this is the norm in this age of darkness Kali Yuga, in which working-class men, as well as women, pretending to be spiritual masters Brahmana, in Sanskrit, are lauded by the ignorant masses, or in Rahasya's case, my students are mostly high, and are often extreme, achievers. They are often among the elite in their areas, from yoga, therapy and sexology, to rocket science, chemistry, computing and physics. The implication seems to be that Rahasya, or whatever is his real name, see the glossary entry, name, personal, is such a great sage that he attracts the most exalted followers. I would hate to use the term disciples, since there is little doubt in my mind that there is no discipline being administered by that pathetic excuse of a man. Because, rocket scientists, chemists, and physicists, by mere virtue of their career paths, are automatically fully enlightened saints, correct? Incorrect. It seems this delusional feminist stooge forgot to attend the class on logical fallacies during his seminary years. Of course, this last quip was purely sarcastic, since Swami Rahasya was never trained in any kind of seminary worthy of the name, but is just a simple worker, who began incompetently teaching Vedanta and Tantra, at the request of a bunch of even more deluded fools. As demonstrated in chapter 20 of this holy scripture, an actual spiritual master is necessarily a member of the holy priesthood and teaches yoga and dharma to seminarians, student priests, and kings, rather than training women to become bossy, pugnacious feminists, as the abject pansy, Swami Rahasya, admits to doing on his public website. That is the antithesis of authentic Dharma, see the glossary entry, Dharma. Again, welcome to this age of darkness. Feminism, an anecdote. Currently, it seems that most women on Earth, definitely, most women in the Western countries, and even in the westernized nations, are feminists, so it would not be difficult to fill this entire chapter, or even this entire book, with anecdotes of how such feminists are destroying civil society with their sinful ideology, and equally criminal practices. However, whilst listening to my digital music player the other day, I came across a particularly humorous example of how delusional or filthy feminist fools. The Scottish singer-songwriter, Annie Lennox, and her musical partner, British composer-arranger, David Alan Stewart, composed, recorded, and published a song entitled, Sisters Are Doin' It For Themselves, in the Christian era 1985. The song was featured on both an album of songs by the duo, known as Eurythmics, called Be Yourself Tonight, and on an album recorded by the American vocalist, Aretha Franklin, called Who's Zoomin' Who. As with all the songs by Eurythmics, this lyric was written by Lennox, and centers around the notion that women were previously seen as the inferior sex, who were, figuratively speaking, chained to the kitchen sink, but, in these times of change, have been liberated from domestic chores, and no longer require men, as evidenced by the fact that women are able to work in previously male-dominated jobs, doctors, lawyers, politicians too. In the song's bridge, the author states, "Don't you know that a man still loves a woman, and a woman still loves a man, just the same way?" It seems that this sentence is an attempt to stress that, despite women desiring to become feminists, they will still love the opposite gender, sex. However, it is simply impossible for a true man to have any respect for a woman in his family, including his own wife or mother, who adheres to feminist practices, such as attempting to usurp dominance in the family, working outside the home, and wearing male clothing, like jeans. Apart from the fact that this woman, Mrs. Anne Lennox, would not even be alive, if not for the input of her patriarch, after he inseminated her mother, the entire premise of the song is flawed, and it is downright hilarious. If not for men, this butch woman, Anne, would have no way to disseminate her perverted, feministic song lyric, because every single technological tool that she used in order to broadcast her message, was invented and fabricated by men. The building that Lennox occupied whilst penning her debauched lyrics, was built by men. The pen and paper that she used to compose the song was manufactured by men. Since personal computers were extremely scarce in the mid-1980s, the motor vehicle in which she and Franklin traveled to United Sound Systems Music Recording Studio, in Detroit, Michigan, USA, was designed and made by men. The roads on which they traveled were paved by men. The recording studio was designed and built by men. The recording equipment was designed and fabricated by men. The musical instruments used to record the track were invented and built by men. The song arrangement was composed by a man. The electricity that powered everything in the studio was invented and supplied by men. The phonographic albums that were sold to the public was invented by a man, Mr. Thomas Edison. The albums were funded and distributed by men, etc., etc. Of course, many feminist fools will counter with, but if those things were not invented by men, women would have made them, eventually. This is certainly possible, but only after literally hundreds or possibly thousands of years, according to the indicators regarding female acumen. As of 2022, approximately 5% of all mechanical engineering patents were filed by females, and in each and every case, the woman was able to create a novel design, predicated upon already established inventions by male patent holders. Women evolved to excel at matters pertaining to procreation, including bearing and nurturing offspring, rather than inventing new contrivances and persistent physical labor. Personally, I have purchased a copy of Eurythmics' Greatest Hits compact disc, but whenever I play the album, I invariably skip "Sisters Are Doin' It for Themselves," for reasons that should be obvious. Even those songs in my collection that contain satanic lyrics, such as a couple of tracks by the English hard rock band, Black Sabbath, are more dharmic, objectively holy, than this filthy feminist drivel. The fact that Satan, i.e. the devil, is a fictional character in diverse ancient mythologies, proves that this assertion is indeed the case. So, Lennox does not need men. This datum does not explain why she married, adulterated, several times, in order to conceive multiple offspring. Perhaps she should have entitled the song, "Sisters Are Slutting Themselves." Annie partnered with a man, in order to bring her demonic song lyrics to fruition. Also, Mrs. A. Lennox relied on literally millions of men, and women, to purchase her recordings, enabling her to taste the financial freedom to proclaim her supposed independence to the world. She conveniently omits the fact that it was evil men who permitted women to come out of the kitchen, in the first place. If not for such pathetic, uxorious men, how are women to achieve their conscious liberation of the female state? They could not, of course, because women, as a sex, are wholly unable to assert dominance over the stronger gender. But obviously, it is a truism that feminism results in the slavery of the female state, rather than genuine liberation, as demonstrated in the previous chapter, as well as within this chapter. During at least one slice of Annie's life, she was an adherent of Vaishnavism, theistic Hinduism, and therefore, she believed, far more than any other theistic tradition, that God is male, so how could she even be extant, if not for the supreme male deity? So much for sisters doing it for themselves. Another one of Mrs. Lennox's songs is even entitled, "I Need a Man," but decisiveness is hardly a feminine trait, am I right, men? Woman, defined. Woman n. Plural. Wom n. She who gives, woe, to man, therefore, woe, eat man. Of course, almost every woman on earth, and even most men, will accuse this author of being a misogynist, for composing the above mock dictionary definition of woman. What to speak of this entire chapter, plus the previous chapter, but the bitter truth must be proclaimed. Factually, I love every human and non-human animal equally, in the sense that I want the best for everyone. As explicated in the 16th chapter of this solitary holy scripture, true love revolves around the notion that one wants the best state of being for all other living creatures, and subsequently, performs actions that attempt to realize this loving desire. The best thing for non-human animals, is for them to be left alone, as far as practical. The best thing for women, is for them to adhere to the normal, natural, and necessary function that they have been designed and/or evolved to do, and unless they keep to their natural societal roles, society shall further advance towards its impending doom. Though I've searched repeatedly, I have not found what I was looking for. Only 1 out of 1,000 men is virtuous, but not one woman. Ecclesiastes 7:28. The Holy Bible, New Living Translation. We must not allow ourselves to be deflected by the feminists, who are anxious to force us to regard the two sexes as completely equal in position and worth. Sigismund Shlomo Freud. Austrian neurologist. It is a naive sort of feminism that insists that women prove their ability to do all the things that men do. This is a distortion and a travesty. Men have never sought to prove that they can do all the things women do. Why subject women to purely masculine criteria? Women can and ought to be judged by the criteria of femininity, for it is in their femininity that they participate in the human race. And femininity has its limitations. So has masculinity. That is what we've been talking about. To do this is not to do that. To be this is not to be that. To be a woman is not to be a man. To be married is not to be single, which may mean not to have a career. To marry this man is not to marry all the others. A choice is a limitation. From Let Me Be a Woman, by Elizabeth Elliot. Belgian-born American writer. The feminist movement taught women to see themselves as victims of an oppressive patriarchy. Self-imposed victimhood is not a recipe for happiness. My analysis is that the gays are about 5% of the attack on marriage in this country, and the feminists are about 95%. Feminism is doomed to failure, because it is based on an attempt to repeal and restructure human nature. Anyone with a child knows that children learn about the world through binary options: up or down, hot or cold, big or little, inside or outside, wet or dry, good or bad, boy or girl, man or woman. But the radical feminists, who staff women's studies departments at most colleges, have propagated the idea that we have to get rid of the gender binary, along with the expectation of distinct roles for men and women. Phyllis Stuart Schlafly. American attorney and conservative activist. N.B. I hereby grant forgiveness to Mrs. Schlafly for using a euphemism for the word homosexual, something I would never dream of doing. The feminist agenda is not about equal rights for women. It is about a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. Marian Gordon, Pat. Robertson. American media mogul and Protestant Christian minister. It seems to be the fashion nowadays for a girl to behave as much like a man as possible. Well, I won't. I will make the best of being a girl, and be as nice a specimen as I can. Sweet and modest, a dear, dainty thing, with clothes smelling all sweet and violet-y, a soft voice, and pretty, womanly ways. Since I'm a girl, I prefer to be a real one. Jessie Bell Manserg, aka Mrs. George de Hornvisey. English writer. P.S. The fact that, upon searching the internet for anti-feminism quotations to use in this chapter, many, if not most, of the quotations I saw were actually in favor of feminism, proves just how gynocentric, feministic, and adharmic, a more apposite and accurate term for leftist, are most major business corporations of the Western world, at least in the era in which this book was composed. See Adharma, in glossary.